13 confirmed murders, over 50 rapes, more than 100 burglaries, all carried out by one person, the alleged perpetrator, a former police officer. This is one of America's most talked about cases carried out by one man over 2 decades. Before we get into what these crimes look like and how it all happened, drop a like, subscribe to this channel and share this video to your friends while we reveal how a man committed heavy crimes and was never caught for decades. He slipped through the cracks of the night, a shadow that haunted California for decades. He was the stranger who broke into bedrooms, the voice that whispered threats in the dark, the monster who left families shattered and survivors scarred for life. For years, he had no face, only names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. But in the end, the world would remember him by one chilling title: the Golden State Killer. In the early 1970s, the Central Valley town of Visalia, California, was a quiet community. But beneath the calm surface, fear was beginning to spread. Homes were being broken into, not for money, but for something stranger. Underwear, photographs, small trinkets. Drawers were left pulled out, furniture disturbed, and in some cases, the intruder left behind an unnerving sense that he had studied his victims before striking. This was the work of the Visalia Ransacker, an unknown prowler who seemed to enjoy the psychological torment of his victims. He just enjoys hurting people. How can someone derive joy from hurting others? What the people of Visalia didn't know was that this was only the beginning, the testing ground for a predator who was about to escalate in ways no one could imagine. By 1976, the violence exploded into the suburbs of Sacramento. Women began reporting brutal late-night home invasions. He wore a ski mask, he carried a gun, and he bound his victims with shoelaces, often taken from their own shoes. At first, he attacked women who were alone, but soon he went after couples. One of his most disturbing tactics was psychological. He would tie up the male partner, place dishes or cups on his back, and whisper, "If I hear these plates rattle, she dies." Then he would drag the woman into another room and rape her, while her helpless partner listened, paralyzed in fear. The East Area Rapist left behind more than 50 sexual assault victims between 1976 and 1979. He wasn't just attacking homes, he was tearing communities apart. Families bought guns, reinforced their windows, and slept with baseball bats by their beds. Neighborhoods formed armed watch groups. The suburbs, once thought to be the safest place to raise a family, were drowning in fear. And still, he slipped away. In 1979, the terror spread south, and his crimes escalated into murder. In Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties, couples were found slain in their own homes. They were bound in familiar fashion. Their lives ended in violence. The press called him the original Night Stalker, but detectives were baffled. Few connected the rapes in Northern California with the murders in the South. To investigators, it seemed as if two separate monsters were at work. But it was only one man. By the time his spree ended in 1986, at least 13 people had been murdered. And then silence. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. For years, detectives speculated. Had he died? Been imprisoned on another charge? Or was he still out there, blending into ordinary life, waiting for the world to forget him? For decades, the Golden State Killer remained a phantom. His crimes faded into cold case files, while survivors lived with memories that refused to fade. One victim later said, "He stole more than a night from me. He stole my sense of safety, my trust, my entire way of living." By the 2010s, technology caught up with the past. Investigators turned to a new, controversial method: genetic genealogy. They uploaded the killer's DNA from old crime scenes into genealogy websites, the same ones ordinary people used to trace their family trees. Piece by piece, through distant cousins and family branches, the net closed around one name: Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., a retired police officer, a husband, a father, living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. In April 2018, detectives pulled DNA from his discarded trash. It was a perfect match. After 40 years of fear and unanswered questions, the Golden State Killer finally had a face. In court, D'Angelo appeared frail, hunched in a wheelchair, a shadow of the predator who once terrorized California. Survivors and victims' families confronted him directly. Their voices were heavy with pain, but also with strength. "You left me broken," one survivor said, "but today you don't get to hide anymore." Another family member of a murder victim told him, "We lived in your shadow for decades, but you will die in a cage." In 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings. He also admitted to dozens of rapes that could no longer be tried because of statutes of limitation. His sentence: life imprisonment without parole. The Golden State Killer changed California forever. He made families install locks and alarm systems, created neighborhoods patrolled by armed citizens, and left entire communities living in fear. But his capture also changed the future of crime solving. The same genetic genealogy used to unmask D'Angelo has since solved countless other cold cases. For the victims and their families, justice came late, but it came. For decades, the Golden State Killer was a faceless terror. But in the end, Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. wasn't a phantom, or a myth, or a ghost in the dark. He was just a man. And unlike the fear he spread, he wasn't eternal. He was found, he was named, and he will never walk free again.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
In 1984, in a quiet Wisconsin town, a teenager set out on foot after a night with friends. She never came home. What followed was a crime so brutal, it haunted the community for decades, until modern science finally uncovered the truth. December in Saukville, Wisconsin, meant snow-covered yards, quiet streets, and the small-town comfort where everyone seemed to know everyone else. In 1984, Saukville was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and teenagers felt safe walking home after a night with friends. For 18-year-old Tracy Lynn Hammerberg, that winter was meant to be filled with possibility. A high school senior with her whole life ahead of her, she was known for her bright personality, her warm smile, and the way she could make friends with anyone. She loved music, laughing with friends, and dreaming about the future. Her family described her as fun-loving, independent, and full of life. A girl with plans, with a future she was only beginning to explore. But all of that would change on one fateful December night. On Friday night, December 14th, Tracy had been out with friends at a house party. There was nothing unusual about it. Just teens gathering, talking, sharing drinks, and enjoying the freedom that came with being young. By midnight, many of her friends had gone home, but Tracy lingered, laughing and chatting. Around 12:30 a.m., she made the decision to head home on foot. Her destination wasn't far, just a few miles. In a close-knit town, it didn't seem dangerous. For Tracy, the walk was familiar. Quiet streets, the crunch of snow under her boots, her breath rising in the cold air. But somewhere along that path, someone crossed into her world. Someone who would ensure she never made it home. Witnesses later recalled seeing Tracy that night, bundled against the cold, making her way through the quiet town. She never appeared afraid. She had no reason to be. It was Saukville, safe, familiar, hers. But in the frozen stillness of that December night, a predator was waiting. Whether it was a chance encounter or something more sinister, no one could know at the time. What is known is that Tracy would never reach her door, never return to the warmth of her home, never live to see another sunrise. By dawn, she was gone. The following morning, December 15th, 1984, the silence of the town shattered. Tracy's body was discovered in the driveway of a home in Grafton, just 4 miles from her own. It was a random location, not connected to her, not connected to her family. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The brutality of the crime stunned investigators and horrified the community. Who could have done this? Why here? And why to her? In an instant, Saukville was transformed. The safe, quiet streets no longer felt secure. Parents held their children tighter. Teenagers who once walked home without fear now asked for rides. The innocence of a small Wisconsin town had been shattered, and the search for answers had only just begun. Tracy Lynn Hammerberg was only 18 years old when her life was stolen. What happened to her that night would remain a mystery for decades, and the hunt for her killer would lead investigators down countless dark paths, before the truth finally emerged 35 years later. By sunrise on December 15, 1984, the reality of the crime set in. Police arrived at the scene in Grafton, a neighboring town just 4 miles from Saukville. The body of 18-year-old Tracy Lynn Hammerberg lay in a driveway, partially clothed, in the bitter Wisconsin cold. The scene was haunting. Fresh snowfall framed a trail of footprints, tire tracks, and signs of a violent struggle. It was the kind of crime Grafton police rarely encountered, let alone one involving a young girl from the community. For investigators, every detail mattered. But one fact stood out most. Tracy had no known connection to the residence where she was found. It wasn't her home. It wasn't a friend's. It seemed random, almost deliberate, as if she had been brought there by force or left there to be found. 1984 was long before modern forensic science. DNA technology, so common today, was still years away. Investigators relied on traditional evidence: blood, fingerprints, fibers, and eyewitness accounts. At the scene, they collected Tracy's clothing and personal belongings, samples from the assault, and impressions of tire marks in the snow. They also noted the position of her body, evidence suggesting she had been attacked elsewhere and left at the driveway. Though the evidence seemed overwhelming, the technology of the time limited how much could actually be analyzed. Still, police knew this was no random accident. This was targeted, violent, and personal. The investigation quickly expanded. Detectives interviewed friends who had seen Tracy at the party the night before. They retraced her last steps, the route she had taken, the people she had spoken to, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her in those final moments. Early suspicion fell on local men who had been at the party. Police questioned several, probing into their whereabouts and alibis. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, and often investigators begin with those closest to the victim. But each lead hit a dead end. Alibis checked out. Timelines didn't match. And frustratingly, no single suspect stood out. As news of the murder spread, Saukville and Grafton were shaken. Small towns thrived on familiarity, but now neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. Rumors ran rampant. Was it a drifter? A jealous ex-boyfriend? Someone who had stalked Tracy from the party? The newspapers reported the case daily, labeling it a brutal, unsolved slaying. For Tracy's family, grief was compounded by uncertainty. Not knowing who had done this or why left them trapped in fear and confusion. Detectives worked around the clock. They chased tips, interviewed anyone connected to Tracy, and followed every possible lead. Dozens of men were questioned, from local acquaintances to complete strangers who had been in the area that night. Evidence from the crime scene was processed, but without DNA analysis, investigators could only compare samples in limited ways. Even the FBI was consulted, offering behavioral profiles that suggested the killer was someone familiar with the area. A man capable of violence. A man who blended in. But despite their efforts, the case stalled. Weeks turned into months, then into years. By the late 1980s, Tracy's murder had grown cold. It remained open. Detectives revisited it periodically, hoping new information would surface. But as time passed, other crimes demanded attention. Evidence sat in storage. Witness memories faded. Leads dried up. For the Hammerberg family, every anniversary was a painful reminder that justice had not been served. Each December, they were forced to relive the night Tracy never came home. The murder of Tracy Lynn Hammerberg left a town paralyzed with fear and investigators searching in vain for answers. Despite exhaustive efforts, the trail grew cold. The case files sat in darkness, waiting. What no one knew then was that hidden in the evidence lay the truth, but science had not yet caught up to reveal it. For 35 years, the murder of Tracy Lynn Hammerberg haunted Saukville and Grafton like a ghost that refused to rest. Every December, the town was reminded of its darkest night. Police officers who had once worked the case retired, some passing the files to younger detectives. Each new generation of investigators opened the boxes of evidence, photographs, reports, and carefully sealed biological samples, and felt the weight of a question that had tormented their predecessors. Who killed Tracy? But year after year, the answer remained buried in silence. By the 2000s, technology had caught up with what investigators had always hoped for: DNA profiling. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene, which had been preserved in storage for decades, was finally tested using modern methods. Analysts extracted a DNA profile, the genetic fingerprint of the killer. It was a huge step forward. Yet, when investigators ran the DNA through CODIS, the National Database of Convicted Offenders and Arrestees, the results were disappointing. No matches. The killer was not in the system. For the Hammerberg family, hope flickered again, only to dim just as quickly. Then came a new frontier: forensic genealogy. This revolutionary method was first made famous in 2018, when investigators used it to identify the notorious Golden State Killer after decades of mystery. The process involved uploading an unknown suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, sites like GEDmatch, where people submitted their DNA to find relatives. By searching for partial matches, investigators could build out family trees and work their way to a suspect. In 2019, investigators turned to this method for Tracy's case. After decades of frustration, the once stalled investigation was suddenly moving again. When the DNA was uploaded, investigators found distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, people who had no idea their genetic material would play a role in solving a murder mystery. With help from genealogists, detectives painstakingly pieced together family connections. Slowly, the branches of the tree pointed them toward a name: Philip Cross. It was a breakthrough that sent chills through the investigative team. Cross wasn't a stranger to the area. In fact, in 1984, he had lived in Port Washington, just a few miles from where Tracy's body was found. But here was the twist: Philip Cross was no longer alive. He had died in 2012 at age 66, never facing justice, never revealing his dark secret. Investigators now had to prove that the DNA belonged to him. They obtained DNA from his surviving family members and compared it. The results were conclusive. Philip Cross was the man who had killed Tracy Lynn Hammerberg. Cross had a troubling history. Court records revealed a man with a violent streak, known to have a drinking problem, and arrests for disorderly conduct and assault. But he had never been convicted of anything serious enough to land his DNA in CODIS. He had slipped through the cracks of the justice system, blending into the background of small-town life. For decades, he carried the secret of what he had done to Tracy. And then he died without ever being held accountable. In 2019, nearly 35 years after the crime, law enforcement stood before cameras to deliver the news. They announced that through forensic genealogy, they had identified Tracy's killer, Philip Cross. Though he would never stand trial, the case was considered closed. For Tracy's family, it was bittersweet. Justice had come, but far too late. They would never hear Cross explain why. They would never see him sentenced. But at last, they knew the truth. For 35 years, the answer had been there, locked inside a single strand of DNA, hidden in the bloodstains, preserved through time, waiting for science to catch up. And when it did, the secret unraveled. The man who ended Tracy's life was no longer alive. But in the silence of his grave, his guilt was written into his genes. The question remained, why? Why would a 66-year-old man attack a teenage girl walking home on a cold December night? The answer would prove as elusive as justice itself. Identifying Philip Cross as the killer should have brought closure. Yet for many, it opened an even deeper wound. Cross was dead. He could not be questioned, could not be confronted, could not be forced to explain the brutal choices he made that December night in 1984. And so, The most haunting question remained: why did he kill Tracy Lynn Hammerberg? Investigators could only speculate. Tracy had been walking home alone, vulnerable in the cold darkness. Cross lived nearby. Was it an opportunity? A predator waiting for a victim? Or had he seen her at the party earlier that night, perhaps even followed her? Some locals whispered that Cross might have known of Tracy, that in small-town Wisconsin, paths often crossed in subtle ways. The truth was unknowable. Without Cross alive to speak, the murder's motive was sealed away forever. Though Cross was never convicted of a serious violent crime, his record painted a troubling picture. Arrests for disorderly conduct, alcohol abuse, an aggressive streak, a man described as unstable, unpredictable, and often drunk. Neighbors recalled him as a man you didn't want to cross paths with on a bad night. Still, no one could have imagined him capable of such brutality. But then again, the warning signs were scattered, small fragments of violence that, in hindsight, pointed toward something darker. For the Hammerberg family, the news in 2019 was bittersweet. After 35 years, they finally had a name. But closure is not the same as justice. They would never see Cross in a courtroom, never hear him admit guilt, never watch a judge sentence him for destroying their daughter's life. Instead, they were left with silence. And in that silence, grief echoed louder than ever. Tracy's siblings spoke of how the murder shaped their lives, how every milestone, every holiday, every family event was shadowed by her absence. Her parents had died before the case was solved, never knowing the truth. For them, justice came too late. Even the community felt the sting of unfinished justice. For decades, suspicion had swirled. People had quietly wondered if it was someone they knew. A neighbor, a coworker, maybe even a friend. Now they knew the truth. But instead of relief, there was unease. Philip Cross had lived among them. He had passed them in grocery stores, stood beside them at gas stations, shared sidewalks with their children. And all the while, he carried the memory of what he had done to Tracy. The mystery of motive wasn't the only lingering question. There were other what-ifs. What if DNA technology had arrived sooner? Could Cross have been caught in the 1990s, still alive to face trial? What if Cross had struck again? Was Tracy his only victim, or had he harmed others who never came forward? And perhaps most painfully, what if Tracy hadn't left the party alone? These unanswered questions turned the case into more than a solved crime. It became a chilling reminder of how fragile justice can be, and how some truths remain forever out of reach. Philip Cross's name closed the case, but it did not close the wounds. The why was gone with him, the chance for justice buried in his grave. And for the Hammerberg family, answers that arrived too late were no answers at all. For Tracy Lynn Hammerberg, the truth finally came to light, but the darkness around why it happened will never fade. In 2019, law enforcement declared the case of Tracy Lynn Hammerberg closed. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Philip Cross was the man who brutally ended her life on that December night in 1984. But unlike most crime stories, there would be no trial, no sentencing, no final confrontation in a courtroom. The killer was gone, his secrets buried with him. For police, it was a success. One of the coldest cases in Wisconsin's history, solved through the perseverance of detectives and the miracle of science. For the Hammerberg family, it was closure that came far too late. Tracy's case wasn't just another solved murder. It became part of a new era of forensic science. The use of genetic genealogy to identify Cross was groundbreaking at the time, following in the footsteps of the Golden State Killer case. Proved that no matter how much time had passed, DNA carried the truth. Detectives across the country began to revisit their own cold cases, asking, could this work for us? Could we finally give answers to families who had been waiting for decades? In a way, Tracy's tragedy helped pioneer a wave of justice for others. Her story showed that even in the face of decades of silence, the truth can still be pulled from the shadows. But at the heart of this story is not science or police work or even Philip Cross. At its heart is Tracy Lynn Hammerberg, an 18-year-old girl with a radiant smile, an open heart, and a future stolen from her. Friends remembered her as a free spirit, fun-loving and kind. She loved music, loved laughter, and had a way of making people feel seen. Her life was only just beginning. Instead of college graduations, careers, or family milestones, her memory lived in newspaper clippings and crime files for 35 long years. When the case was finally closed, vigils were held. Candles were lit in her honor. Her name was spoken not in whispers of tragedy, but in love, a reminder that she was not just a victim, but a daughter, a friend, and a young woman whose life mattered. In interviews, Tracy's surviving siblings expressed gratitude to investigators who never gave up, but their words carried the weight of heartbreak. Her parents had passed away before the case was solved, never knowing who killed their daughter. That truth, the fact that justice arrived too late for them to hear, was perhaps the most painful detail of all. Still, they took comfort in knowing the truth was finally revealed. No more rumors, no more wondering. The name was known, and with that name, the Hammerberg family could begin, at last, to grieve in peace. Tracy's case has become part of a much larger conversation. How far should we go with forensic genealogy? What does it mean for privacy, for the use of public DNA databases, for ethics? But for many families, those questions are secondary to the simple fact that the technology works. It brings answers where once there was only silence. For the community of Saukville and Grafton, it was proof that justice may be delayed, but it does not have to be denied. For 35 years, the case of Tracy Lynn Hammerberg was a story of violence unanswered, a question left hanging in the cold Wisconsin air. Today, we know the name of her killer, but more importantly, we remember her name, Tracy Lynn Hammerberg. She is more than a case file. She is a life that mattered. And though the shadows of December 1984 will never fully fade, her light still shines. It began in a town where nothing ever seemed to happen, until one October night when someone vanished without a trace. Acilla, Georgia, a quiet place tucked away in the southern countryside, where pecan orchards line the roads and neighbors wave to one another from their front porches. It was the kind of town where the church bells still rang on Sunday, where the biggest events were high school football games and beauty pageants. But beneath that simplicity was a story that would grip the nation. The story of a woman whose life seemed picture-perfect, until it suddenly wasn't. Her name was Tara Grinstead. To her students, she was the teacher who never forgot to encourage the shy kid in the back row. To her friends, she was the woman who always lit up a room with her smile. And to her community, she was more than a teacher. She was their own beauty queen, the hometown girl who once stood proudly on the stage at the Miss Georgia pageant. But Tara wasn't just admired. She was loved. She invested herself in every role she played, as a history teacher at Irwin County High School, as a mentor for young women competing in local pageants, and as a daughter and sister whose warmth seemed endless. At just 30 years old, she had already become the kind of figure people looked up to. Still, beneath her polished image and radiant presence, Tara longed for something more: stability, love, and a future that felt certain. Those who knew her best said she carried both ambition and vulnerability, though you would rarely see her without her trademark smile. In Acilla, Tara was a constant. Her presence was expected everywhere, at the school, at pageants, at local gatherings. And that consistency made what happened in late October 2005 all the more unthinkable. That Saturday, the small town bustled with excitement. It was the weekend of the Miss Sweet Potato pageant, and as always, Tara was there to guide her students, coaching them with the same patience and passion that had made her a standout competitor years before. She was seen laughing, chatting, and encouraging those she mentored. To everyone around her, it was just another ordinary evening. But when Tara drove back to her modest home later that night, something shifted. For reasons no one could see, no one could predict, Tara Grinstead would never emerge from that house again. By Monday morning, her absence was undeniable. The teacher who never missed class, the woman whose schedule was as dependable as the sunrise, was suddenly gone. In towns like Acilla, news doesn't just spread, it explodes. Within hours, whispers turned into panic, and panic turned into dread. Because if someone like Tara could vanish, then safety itself was an illusion. What happened behind those closed doors on that October night? Who, or what, waited for her when she came home? And how could the life of a woman so deeply rooted in her community simply vanish, leaving only silence behind? Saturday, October 22nd, 2005. For most people in Asilla, it was just another weekend in a small Georgia town. For Tara Grinstead, it was a day filled with the routines she loved: coaching, mentoring, and showing up for her students. By evening, the Miss Sweet Potato pageant had wrapped up, and the excitement of the local competition carried over into a friendly cookout. Guests remembered Tara arriving dressed casually, smiling, her energy as warm as always. She mingled, laughed, and shared conversations that seemed so ordinary, so forgettable at the time. No one there could have guessed they would be the last to see her alive. She left the gathering around 11 p.m., heading back to her small single-story house on West Park Street. From the outside, it was the picture of suburban simplicity. A cozy home with a porch light that usually stayed on. Neighbors later recalled seeing her car, a black Mitsubishi, parked neatly in the driveway that night. Everything looked normal, quiet, safe. But by the next morning, something subtle had already shifted. Calls to Tara's phone went unanswered. Friends assumed she was resting, maybe busy. On Sunday evening, she was expected to visit her mother, but she never arrived. That small break in her predictable pattern was the first ripple in what would soon become a tidal wave of panic. By Monday morning, the alarm bells could no longer be ignored. At Irwin County High School, where Tara's presence was as certain as the ringing of the first bell, her absence sent shockwaves. She hadn't called in sick. She hadn't sent word. Her classroom sat empty, her desk untouched. For a teacher as devoted as Tara, this was unthinkable. Coworkers called her home. No answer. Friends stopped by, knocking on the door. Silence. By mid-morning, the realization hit with chilling clarity. Tara Grinstead had vanished. When law enforcement arrived, the scene only deepened the mystery. Her Mitsubishi was still parked in the driveway. Inside the house, her cell phone and purse remained untouched. The lights were off, the door locked. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if she had simply stepped outside and disappeared into thin air. But one item stood out, something that didn't belong. Lying in her front yard, just feet from the porch, was a single latex glove. At first, it seemed almost trivial, like a discarded remnant of yard work. But in a case where nothing else seemed out of place, that glove would take on a sinister significance. Neighbors were interviewed. Some recalled hearing dogs barking that night, but no screams, no struggle. Others swore they saw nothing unusual. It was Asilla. People looked out for each other, but no one was watching for danger because danger simply didn't belong here. As the day stretched on, worry turned into organized chaos. A missing persons report was filed. Volunteers began searching. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood. Helicopters swept the fields and woods surrounding town. And yet, there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no evidence that pointed to where Tara might have gone. For Asilla, the unease grew unbearable. A town that prided itself on knowing every face, every car that passed down its streets, suddenly had no answers. Fear spread quickly. If someone like Tara, a woman whose life was intertwined with nearly everyone's in town, could vanish so completely, then no one was safe. The rumor mill churned. Was it a jealous ex-boyfriend? A stranger passing through? Or someone much closer to home? Everyone seemed to have a theory, but no one had the truth. The silence around Tara's disappearance wasn't just disturbing. It was suffocating. In a community built on familiarity and trust, her absence left a void that swallowed the town whole. And just days into the investigation, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The mystery of Tara Grinstead would not be solved quickly. This wasn't a simple missing person case. It was something far darker. Because if the answer was out there, hidden in plain sight, then why did it feel like everyone in Asilla was suddenly blind? From the very first days after Tara Grinstead's disappearance, the case was treated with urgency. State investigators, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, and local law enforcement all converged on Asilla, determined to find answers. The missing teacher's story spread quickly through television and newspapers, her face appearing on national broadcasts within days. In the small town of Asilla, investigators combed through every street and every field. Search dogs traced the air for her scent. Helicopters scanned pecan orchards and wooded lots, and volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through tall grass and farmland. But despite the overwhelming manpower, there was nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no tracks leading away from her home. The only tangible piece of evidence remained the latex glove. It was carefully bagged and sent for forensic testing. Weeks later, investigators announced that DNA had been found on it, belonging to both Tara and an unknown male. It was a discovery that electrified the case, and yet it brought no resolution. The DNA didn't match anyone in state or federal databases. Without a name, without a face, the glove was a clue that seemed to taunt the investigators more than guide them. Meanwhile, the community lived under a shadow. Asilla was small, the kind of place where people waved at passing cars and left their doors unlocked. But the disappearance fractured that sense of security. Suddenly, everyone was a suspect. Friends eyed friends. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Theories spread through diners, barbershops, and church pews. Some believed a stranger had wandered into town. Others were certain it had to be someone close to her, someone who knew Tara's routines. Investigators followed every lead, no matter how thin. They interviewed former boyfriends, colleagues, and acquaintances. They checked out sex offenders in the area. Hundreds of tips poured in, each one raising hope, only to fade into another dead end. Months passed, then years. Every anniversary of her disappearance brought renewed media attention, vigils, and sorrow. Her family begged for answers. Her students mourned the absence of their beloved teacher, and detectives continued to chase rumors that led nowhere. The glove was retested with advancing technology as the years went on, but still no match appeared. The case remained frozen, preserved in headlines but absent of progress. Meanwhile, the story grew beyond Asilla. National programs like America's Most Wanted and 2020 featured Tara's case, putting a spotlight on Irwin County and the mystery that lingered there. The attention brought waves of tips and speculation, but again, no breakthrough. Behind the scenes, investigators carried their frustration like a weight. They knew the answers were out there, but the silence in Asilla was deafening. It wasn't just a lack of evidence. It was as though an entire community had been bound by an invisible code of secrecy. People whispered, but few spoke out loud. The years carved away at hope. Families moved forward, students graduated, and still Tara's home on West Park Street remained a haunting reminder. Her car was eventually returned to her family. Her belongings were boxed up, but the unanswered question lingered in every corner of Asilla. Who took Tara, and why? By 2015, 10 years after her disappearance, the case had grown ice cold. Law enforcement admitted they had exhausted nearly every resource. Her family, devastated but determined, held on to the belief that someone knew something, and that time might finally loosen tongues. But in those silent years, another force was brewing, one that no detective could have predicted. A cultural shift in how crime stories were told was about to change everything. And Tara's case, after sitting dormant for more than a decade, was about to be pulled back into the spotlight by an unlikely source. Not a cop, not a private investigator, but a young filmmaker with a microphone. And in 2016, the silence that had cloaked Asilla for more than a decade was about to be shattered. By 2016, Tara Grinstead's name had faded from national headlines. To many outside of Asilla, she was just another cold case in a country full of them. But inside that small Georgia town, her absence was still an open wound. Teachers still remembered the smile that lit up her classroom. Former students carried memories of her encouragement. Her family clung to fading hope, even as the years felt like a cruel echo chamber. Then, something unexpected happened. A young filmmaker named Payne Lindsay, fascinated by unsolved mysteries, stumbled across Tara's case while searching the internet for documentary ideas. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't an insider. He was just a curious storyteller, armed with curiosity, determination, and a microphone. In August of 2016, Payne launched a podcast called Up and Vanished. At first, it was just a passion project, a way to explore what had happened to the beauty queen who had disappeared without a trace. But almost immediately, it began to snowball. Listeners from across the country tuned in, drawn to Payne's raw narration, his willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, and the haunting silence that still surrounded Ascilla. For Tara's community, the podcast was like a stone thrown into still water. Long-buried whispers began to surface. People who had stayed quiet for over a decade suddenly felt the pressure of national attention pressing in on them. Calls poured in. Old acquaintances were re-interviewed. Rumors that had been passed quietly in backyards and kitchens suddenly made their way into public conversation. As Payne dug deeper, his podcast episodes revealed a town caught between loyalty and fear. Some residents bristled at the attention, angry that an outsider was reopening old wounds. But others felt liberated. At last, someone was demanding answers. The timing was perfect. Social media amplified every episode, and soon Up and Vanished was not just a podcast, it was a movement. Millions of listeners tuned in, making it one of the most downloaded true crime podcasts in history. What had once been a dormant case now felt alive, pulsing with new energy. And behind the scenes, that attention created real pressure. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, once criticized for a case that had gone cold, found itself under the microscope again. Tips that had been ignored or dismissed years earlier suddenly resurfaced. Whispers began pointing toward two men who had once walked the halls of Irwin County High School as Tara's students, Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. For years, their names had floated in low tones around Ascilla. Nothing concrete, nothing bold enough to break through the silence. But now, with Payne's podcast stirring the pot, those whispers became harder to ignore. Investigators began quietly re-examining their files. And in February of 2017, less than a year after the podcast launched, the GBI shocked the world. Ryan Duke was arrested for the murder of Tara Grinstead. The news hit Ascilla like a thunderclap. A face they had known, a former student of Tara's, was paraded in handcuffs, accused of the crime that had haunted the town for over a decade. Alongside him, another name surfaced, Bo Dukes, accused of helping cover up the crime and dispose of Tara's body. It was the break that Tara's family had begged for, but the revelation raised even more questions than it answered. Why had it taken 12 years for the truth to come out? Why had so many people stayed silent? And most chilling of all, what exactly had happened on that October night in 2005? The podcast had done what law enforcement alone could not. It cracked open a wall of secrecy. But with that breakthrough came a dark, harrowing truth. The world would soon learn just how Tara's life had ended, and the details would haunt her community forever. The confessions were coming, and with them, a horrifying journey into a pecan orchard where Tara's final moments were forever erased. When investigators announced the arrest of Ryan Duke in February 2017, the world expected clarity. After 12 years of silence, surely the mystery of Tara Grinstead's disappearance was finally solved. But instead of closure, what followed was a tangled web of confessions, contradictions, and lingering doubts. Ryan Duke, gaunt and almost ghost-like in his first court appearance, seemed an unlikely killer. Yet in the interrogation room, he told investigators that he had broken into Tara's home on that October night. He claimed he never meant to kill her, that it was a burglary gone wrong. He said he struck her, panicked, and then called his friend, Bo Dukes, to help him cover up the crime. The details were chilling. According to Ryan, Tara's body was taken to a remote pecan orchard owned by Bo's family. There, under a cloak of darkness, her remains were destroyed in a fire that would burn for days. When investigators searched the orchard years later, they found traces, small fragments of bone and ash scattered in the soil. The orchard had swallowed Tara whole, leaving almost nothing behind. For her family, it was a devastating revelation. Not only had they lost their daughter, their sister, their friend, they would never even have a body to lay to rest. But then came the twist. Ryan Duke recanted. In a stunning reversal, he claimed his confession was false, that he had been coerced, and that the real killer was Bo Dukes. He insisted Bo had killed Tara, and he had been dragged into the cover-up against his will. The conflicting stories cast a dark cloud over the entire case. Which version was true? Was Ryan genuinely guilty, or was he a pawn shielding his friend? And why? For over a decade, had both men remained silent while Tara's family searched for answers. Bo Dukes, for his part, admitted his involvement, but only in disposing of Tara's body. He painted Ryan as the killer, the one who struck the fatal blow. To investigators, it seemed like two men locked in a macabre dance, each pointing the finger at the other. The orchard itself became a symbol of the town's torment. Families had passed it for years, never knowing it held the secret to Tara's disappearance. When the truth surfaced, it wasn't just a location. It was a graveyard of trust, a reminder of how darkness had hidden in plain sight. For the community, the revelations cut deep. Ryan and Bo weren't strangers. They weren't outsiders. They were men who had grown up in Asilla, attended the same schools, walked the same streets. And now they stood accused of committing and concealing one of the most heinous crimes the town had ever seen. Still, critical questions remained unanswered. Why Tara? Why that night? Was it truly a burglary gone wrong, or something more sinister? Some wondered if jealousy, obsession, or anger had played a role. Others whispered that more people knew what had happened than were admitting. The air was thick with suspicion, and the silence that had once cloaked Asilla felt even more unbearable now that fragments of the truth had surfaced. The trials ahead promised answers. But as the community soon discovered, the road to justice would only deepen the mystery, because in the courtroom, truth and lies would blur once again. And Tara's family would learn that even with confessions, closure remained heartbreakingly out of reach. By the time the arrests were made, Tara Grinstead had been gone for more than a decade. Families had raised children, students she once taught had become adults, and the quiet town of Asilla had carried on under the shadow of her absence. Now, the long-awaited trials promised something her family had craved for years: answers. But justice, when it finally came, was not as clear as anyone hoped. In 2019, Bo Dukes faced the courtroom first, not for murder, but for his role in the cover-up. Jurors listened as prosecutors described the pecan orchard, the fire, and the deliberate destruction of Tara's remains. It was not only a crime against Tara, but an offense against truth itself, erasing evidence, silencing her voice, and tormenting her family. The verdict was swift: guilty. Bo Dukes was sentenced to 25 years in prison. For some, it felt like a victory. For others, it was too little, too late. After all, he had walked free for more than a decade while Tara's loved ones lived with nothing but questions. Then came the trial of Ryan Duke in 2022. Expectations were high. This was the man who had once confessed to killing Tara. Surely this would bring the closure her family deserved. But the proceedings unfolded like a storm. Ryan's defense painted him as a man coerced into confession, vulnerable and manipulated. The prosecution fought back with the fragments of his own words, pointing to his past admissions. In the end, the jury stunned the courtroom. Ryan Duke was acquitted of murder, yet he was convicted of concealing Tara's death and sentenced to 10 years in prison. For Tara's family, it was a bittersweet outcome. A conviction, yes, but not for the crime that had stolen their daughter and sister. The truth still felt elusive, slipping like sand through their fingers. The trials provided pieces of a puzzle, but not the whole picture. Who truly killed Tara? Was it Ryan, as his first confession said? Or Bo, as Ryan later claimed? Or was the full truth buried with her in the ashes of that orchard? Even with two men behind bars, the sense of finality never arrived. For Asilla, the damage was lasting. A small town once defined by community pride now carried the infamy of a national tragedy. The case had exposed fractures, secrets kept, whispers ignored, loyalties misplaced. It left neighbors questioning how such a crime could remain hidden in plain sight for so long. For Tara's family, the heartbreak was sharper. There would be no gravesite to visit, no remains to lay to rest, no peaceful goodbye. The orchard had stolen even that. All they had left were memories. A radiant daughter who crowned beauty pageants with grace. A teacher who inspired students with compassion. a sister whose smile could brighten even the darkest room. And for the world beyond Ascilla, Tara's story became a reflection of something larger. The way silence can shield truth, the way justice can feel incomplete, and the way a single life can echo far beyond the boundaries of a small Georgia town. Even now, after trials, convictions, and years of scrutiny, the case of Tara Grinstead lingers in the air like an unfinished sentence. Justice was served, but only in fragments. The orchard may hold its secrets forever. Her story reminds us that closure is not always possible, that even in courtrooms and headlines, the truth can remain obscured. And yet, her legacy lives on, not in the way she died, but in the way she lived, with beauty, purpose, and an unshakable impact on those who loved her. Because in the end, the mystery of Tara Grinstead is not just about who took her life, but about the silence that allowed the truth to hide for so long. And in that silence, the haunting question remains: will we ever truly know? If you found these stories powerful, consider sharing them with your friends, so that their light continues to shine daily and beyond the tragedy that took away their lives. Like and subscribe for more deep true crime stories, where every detail matters and every truth hides behind another. Because in the end, justice isn't always as clear as it seems. Every story matters, every life matters. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.